deep and long-standing commitment to the teaching of the liberal arts and what that means for a free republic. And so there are some things that we're going to talk about this morning with regard to education and the connections between good education and the continuing health of our republic. What we're going to do here is I'm going to speak for a few minutes to talk about some of the work that we're doing at Hillsdale College through this charter school initiative. Dr. Moore will come up and talk more broadly about education issues in general. He has a broad-ranging list of things that he could cover there. So I think just the conversations leading up to the beginning of the session this morning and seeing what is on your mind and where you're coming from probably will weave its way into that a little bit. So what we'd like to do for the time that we've got is we're both going to deliver some remarks, and we are going to reserve some time at the end for questions. So there may be some things that we'll talk about that will raise questions in your mind. Feel free to just make a note so that you don't forget that, because we want to have a conversation at the end to address things that you might be wondering about. So just make that comment here at the beginning. Hillsdale College began seriously looking at K-12 education and what it can do about that a few years ago, about 4 years ago, and through some conversations that Dr. Larry Arnn, our college president, had with some of the faculty, in particular with Dr. Moore, some specific ideas began to emerge about what could be done with regard to K-12 education. Dr. Coles mentioned just a little bit ago, there's not much question really in the country that K-12 education is in trouble. There are many indicators of what the problems are symptomatically. What the causes are is something that really is worthy of extensive discussion, and that's what you're engaged in. But what we wanted to do is really put forth an effort to help a resurgence of a certain type of education. Classical education is the express focus of our charter school initiative. And over the last 40 or 50 years in this country, there have been a number of schools that have emerged as classical schools, almost exclusively in the private school domain. But with the advent of the charter school vehicle about 20 years ago, it really opened the door for the possibility of a restoration, and I use that word specifically, a restoration of that kind of education in the public school domain. Because about 100 years ago, virtually all schools in the country were essentially classical. And then there's a long and sordid history of how we got to where we are today that has been about a 75 to 100 year trajectory. And it's been with us, our entire generation, our parents' generation, such that no one alive today really knows what it looks like, what it looked like then from a personal standpoint. And so we are completely acclimated to what is the contemporary education model in public schools today. There are many things that this progressive educational philosophy that took over the schools, how that's permeated what we're doing. And I'm going to leave some specifics there to Dr. Moore, because sometimes things are very obvious, sometimes things are very subtle. And to be able to mute the effect of the progressive educational philosophy, you have to thoroughly understand what it actually is and what it's done and how it manifests in the school. And many times you'll see conservative political leaders that don't understand that at all. And they will join right in with sort of the contemporary thinking and things that sound good from the stump, but during their speeches. But in fact, really understanding what's going on in public education and the reasons that we're having the problems that we're having, and the fact that we have the answers and the model of how that should work, because up until 100 years ago, it was completely ubiquitous. That's what education was in the West for over a couple of millennia. So this is not a new kind of thing. this is, if ever the term tried and true was appropriate, it applies to this kind of education. And this is why Hillsdale College is so committed to this, because it's been the very heartbeat of our own college's educational philosophy for the 168 years that we've been in existence. So it was only logical that classical education was the type of educational philosophy and model that we're trying to promote in the public school domain. And that specifically is the mission of the charter school initiative that we have. There was a single-page handout that was distributed a little bit ago. I'm not going to walk through that. I just want to point out that some of the things that are written there in the top two-thirds of that page describe the fundamental characteristics of these kinds of schools. And again, I think that you'll see sort of a compare and contrast type of thought process as Dr. Moore talks about, because I think he'll probably mention some things that will be diametrically opposed to the types of ideas that are set forth there. At the bottom of that page, I lifted some direct quotes. None of those are my words. They're direct quotes from the ohio.gov website that talks about community schools, charter schools. The whole country refers to them as charter schools. Here in Ohio, the term in the state law has been defined as community schools. And you've got a speaker later this afternoon that's going to talk specifically about charter schools, so I'm not going to try to replicate that. We are extending our initiative all over the country wherever there are charter school laws, and as of Tuesday, there are now 42 states plus the District of Columbia with the state of Washington's passage of the charter school law, although just by a razor's edge, unfortunately. So there are 42 states plus the District of Columbia where we can go and help start these kind of charter schools. So let me tell you just for a couple of minutes about the nature of the program that we are engaged in. Hillsdale College serves as the role of an advisor and an academic architect, if you will, to schools. These schools are not schools that we start. We do not have an official governance role in them. And so what we do is we respond to leadership that arises in a community that says we want to have a classical charter school in our community. And we've been in conversations with folks here in Ohio. Mr. Coyle is on the board of the Classical Academy of Columbus, and we've been working with them for some time in the genesis of their effort to found a classical charter school here in the greater Columbus area. So that's what we do. When groups contact us and say that we would like to have a school like this in our community, we start a conversation with them because we want to understand that we have an alignment on the educational philosophy, that they are seeking the same things that we are seeking, and that we would be good colleagues, if you will, on this. And so as that conversation continues and we establish that alignment and oneness of mind and purpose, then we begin to work with them in the establishment of their academic program, which of course the first step on that is getting agreement on what the foundational elements of this kind of school would be from an academic standpoint and philosophical standpoint. And so they prepare founding documents, which ultimately and very directly feed into the writing of their charter application. So this beginning process really is a rich conversation, and it's very productive for the school, and it leads then directly into things that happen around just immediately prior to and then subsequent to the approval of their charter by their authorizer, or again here in the state of Ohio, that entity is referred to as a sponsor. So the other things, there are three other things that happen once we really get the ball rolling with them from a philosophical and a founding document standpoint. We also help them, and actually more than help, we really are the designers of their curriculum. So and I think again there are some things that Dr. Moore probably referred to that will give you a little bit more of an idea, and there's also some things on the list that's in front of you that very specifically are designed into the curriculum that we prepare for them. And much of that is done prior to the charter application being submitted, because there's a bit of that content that has to be documented in the charter application. And then subsequent to that, more detail comes into place whenever the third aspect of the help that we give comes together, and that is finding a school principal. We'll help the group find a school principal. They're the search as well, but the kind of talent, I'll use that word, the kind of person really that it takes to run a classical charter school is unfortunately not to be commonly found. It takes a certain kind of education, but it also takes, as you know, a certain amount of leadership, a certain temperament, a certain kind of commitment to not just education reform, but the idea of education itself, and an understanding of what the ends of education are. See, I think that there's a lot of confusion about what the purpose of that is. What you hear today from every turn, and certainly from every political speech, is that the whole reason our schools exist is in order to be able to prepare students for 21st century workplace with critical thinking skills and being able to compete in the global marketplace and all that kind of thing. I would submit that that is not the purpose of education. And so I'll just leave that one as a teaser for a minute, because I think you're going to hear a little bit more about that shortly. But the kind of person who can lead a school like this has to really understand what the school is there for in the first place. Finally, the fourth thing that we do, in addition to helping them find a school principal, is the teachers that teach at a school like this have to understand that this is a different kind of school. It has a different kind of mission, has a different kind of philosophy, has a different kind of curriculum, a different kind of school culture. And in order to teach effectively in this kind of school, we need to spend some time with the teachers in order to educate them about how the life of this school should proceed. And in a new school, you get a number of new teachers that are fresh out from college. They don't have any experience in education per se, generally. Hopefully they've got a good foundation in the study of the liberal arts. And again, you all know this, but I'll just say it again to make it crystal clear. A lot of people hear the word liberal arts and they think humanities. Think of the four traditional subject areas: math, science, history, and English. The liberal arts are rock solid in these areas, and students that graduate from a good classical school are solid in math and science. You do not have to have a STEM academy or something like that in order to be able to make sure that this country does not fall behind when it comes to technology and engineering and so forth. That is something that colleges are doing a good job of, and trade schools that they can do, but in K-12 education, they need a foundation, and that kind of foundation is richly provided at a good classical school. So we do teacher training with these schools for several days prior to their opening, generally at the end of August, beginning of September when they open. We will spend time with them in the month of August once the faculty is assembled. And that's an investment on our part, because it's necessary to make sure that these kinds of schools launch properly, get off on the right foot, and can actually make the thing that happens that the school is there to have happen, which is the teacher and the student in the classroom with a good curriculum cause education and learning to happen. Everything outside of that is peripheral and supportive. That is what's in the crosshairs of what a school should be thinking about. So this is really our effort. It's to help groups that decide that this is the kind of school that they want to have in the community. They don't have many places to turn to really understand and get assistance and counsel and guidance and education and training on how a classical school should operate. And we wish that there were a lot of other groups out there doing what we were doing, and it was even a little bit competitive. Unfortunately, it's not. We really don't know much of anywhere else that this kind of thing is happening, unfortunately. So we're reaching out to groups all over the country. I said that we started this effort about 4 years ago. It came into concrete existence about 3 years ago, and through the spring, summer, and fall of 2009. And in 2010, we began actively seeking the first groups that we would provide assistance to, we were really looking for one group just through an initial search to launch the effort. And in the response that we got from several different parts of the country, we actually found 3 groups that we wanted to move forward with. And 2 of those 3 groups today are operating a classical charter school, one in Texas and one in New Mexico. They both opened this past August and September timeframe. So when we started to work with them in 2010, and they opened in 2012, that reflects about what is normal, about a 2-year cycle time to get a charter school open. A 3rd group that we worked with is opening their school in Savannah, Georgia this coming August of 13. So those 3 are all either operating or have their charter in hand. Savannah just got their charter a few weeks ago. The timeline in Georgia was a little odd, so it really pushed them into the 2013 cycle. And there are more to follow. There are additional groups that we're working with all over the country right now, and we see really no end in sight, happily, to this kind of thing all over the country. So with that, I know you probably have some questions, but I think we'll have some time at the end. In fact, I know we will to talk about some things, but I want to bring up Dr. Moore to talk about whatever it is that he would like to talk about. So, we're very happy to be here, and we'll have some more time to have a conversation here at the conclusion of his remarks. So, Dr. Moore, why don't you come ahead?
How are y'all doing? Good. This last week has been something. Well, thank you for having us out here. I'll just try to launch right into it. How many of you have been around people before when you're talking about schools, parents maybe, particularly mothers of young children who are maybe 4 or 5 and they're starting to think about where those kids are going to school. And you've heard the following conversation. Where are you going to send your kids to school? Very nervously, by the way. And then the other person says, well, you know, it's hard to find a good school out there. And then they start agreeing with each other. Oh, yeah, those schools out there, public schools, are not what they used to be, so on and so forth. But then you finally get around to the answer and is, well, I'm going to send my kids to the school down the street, Jefferson School, regular public school. And both mothers say, oh, that's such a good school. Because why? Because it's in our suburb. It's in our community. It's in our neighborhood. And we live in a nice neighborhood. There's a Best Buy just down the street. We don't have crime very much in our neighborhood. A little vandalism here and there, but nothing big. So our school ought to be good. And it should be. The sad truth is, it's not. Because that same question is had all over the country, in every suburb, in every small town, and everybody who says, oh, those schools out there are terrible. Those poor kids in the inner city who have such an awful education. But our schools are good. They're not good. I know because I grew up and went to a suburban school. And that was way back in the 80s before they had completely fallen off the cliff. Things are 100 times worse now. And so I want to spend a little time talking about that, and maybe I'm just preaching to the choir, but I want to make sure that I spend some time talking about why that statement that I just made is true, before we go on to talk about how we could reconstruct and remake public schools. The reason that it's true is because the people who are in charge of the public schools are not themselves educated. They have no understanding of education. They have no appreciation of education. All of their training has taught them to despise and be suspicious of education. These are people who do not wake up on a Saturday morning and read Shakespeare and then go off to a play and talk to their children about important things in history. They would never think of doing those things. Can you name for me a superintendent of schools in this country who has ever quoted Shakespeare? It sounds ridiculous, right? They're full of all sorts of jargon about standards and 21st century work skills and all that sort of stuff, and they would never think of quoting Shakespeare or a founding father. They don't know any math, by the way. They'll get up there and talk about math all day long in STEM subjects. Ask them to do a simple proof. Ask them why, when you divide a fraction by a fraction, you flip the second fraction and multiply it. Ask them that question. They can't tell you. The people who are in charge of them schools, who are in charge of our schools, are not themselves educated, and they despise and are suspicious of education and of educated people. That's one thing. Another thing is, deep down, they don't actually trust the founding principles of this country. And whenever they are reminded of the fact that this country is built on certain founding principles, they're not going to like to hear that. There's some other reasons as well. They're part of a union, which means they're part of trying to make as much money as they can with doing as little work as possible. That's what unions do. Let me give you a couple of reasons why I say these things, because I know them firsthand. I taught for a time at a college in Ohio, a nice college called Ashland University, which, by the way, has a huge education department and puts lots of teachers into your schools in Ohio. Now, the first thing I noticed, I was just a young whippersnapper out of graduate school. The first thing I noticed is that the valedictorian of the Ashland School was in my class, and he sat on the front row. And he was as eager a student as I've ever had. He took meticulous notes. He was a nice guy, smart as a whip. And he did not know a thing. He had never heard the name Plato. He didn't know the first thing about George Washington. He didn't know the difference between the Constitution on the one hand and the Declaration on the other. Most kids these days confuse the two all the time. They'll just vaguely say, oh, that sounds like the Constitution. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those words are not in the Constitution. That's what you have. But at least he was on the front row. At least he was an eager student. At least he was soaking it all up. And for the first time, he was being given an education, not just in my class, but in a bunch of classes. And at the end of 4 years, he knew something. That was a good story. That's the good side of the story. The bad side of the story is I had a whole bunch of students along the back row of the class. Those students never raised their hands. They didn't take very good notes. Come test time, they were somewhere in the D range. When they had to turn in a paper, they were in the C- range, probably because they got a lot of help, or at least some help, not a ton of help. And they would get by with a C- or a D+. Not interested in education. Didn't come to my office hours and say, how can I get better at this? Do you know who those teachers... No, I'm just kidding. Wait! Do you know who those students were?
Your future teacher.
They're your children's teachers.
Your future teacher.
And all of you folks who are on school boards right now, you have to know that. That's who's... All your parents have to know that. That's who's teaching your children. Now, there are a couple of exceptions. I had a couple of good ed majors who would come up to me after class and ask more questions, who wanted to know more. And guess what? They despised their education classes. At the beginning of every year, I would have students come up to me almost in tears saying, I don't think I want to be a teacher. I would say, why? That's a good, noble calling. Why don't you want to do that? And what it ended up being is they were so frustrated with their education classes that they wanted to bail. And they wanted to take real history classes, real English classes, real math classes. So I would have to talk them back into the idea of being a teacher, despite what was going on in the education department. That's the way that it was. I won't even tell you about the conversations, well, I can tell you about one of the conversations I had with the dean of the education school. When they were rewriting their curriculum and trying to put together a philosophy of education class, I said, well, don't you think that instead of just reading this really dry, boring, lifeless textbook, that you should actually read some philosophy of education, such as John Locke, such as Plato. And the dean of the education school said to me, no, because our emphasis is not on philosophers, but on philosophies.
That's true.
You can unravel the logic of that. You deserve an honorary education. Or how about this? When I said one time, I was actually invited into the class because I was so outspoken on education. She invited me to teach her classes at one point. And I came in and talked with the students who were interested in the things I had to say, believe it or not. And after the class, I suggested, don't you think that what you should actually do in your education classes, instead of having all these meaningless discussions about method and all that, why don't you actually teach them some things? Why don't you teach them what the Constitution says? Why don't you teach them some historical things to augment the things we do in the history department? And she said, no, because our emphasis is not on students knowing things, but on knowing how to know things. How do you know things without... What? There again, that statement makes no sense. To know how to know things. So at any rate, I got sort of fed up. And I also met a lovely wife, and that was sort of my mission. And so we decided this town was too small for the both of us, so we packed up and moved out to Colorado and helped start a charter school, where I was the principal. And I got to hire the teachers I wanted to. I got to have the curriculum I wanted to. I got to train them the way that I wanted to. I did not, unlike in the state of Ohio, have to have certified teachers. And I made a pretty good school with the help of some other folks, particularly my board who had confidence in me. And the kids who were coming out of that school knew things that I didn't know until I was in graduate school. And it was pretty amazing. And the school board, by the way, didn't like us. They didn't have nice things to say about us. Even when our school was ranked number one high school in the state, and then Money Magazine put in their top communities to live in the country. When Fort Collins hit number one, and there was a little blurb, highly rated schools. What do you think the school district did? But put on their website, come to Fort Collins, where you have highly rated schools. Well, it wasn't their ratings, it was our ratings that got us the number one city award. But that's a minor detail to them. But the thing that I know, and the reason why I say the suburban schools are no good anywhere, is because I used to have parents coming to me who couldn't get their kids into the school because it was already filled up, begging to see if there was any way that those kids could get into our school. The kids who would come to our school, sometimes as freshmen, sometimes as sophomores, could not write a sentence. Sometimes the kid, of course, they'd never heard anything. They'd never been taught anything. Sometimes their skills were so low, we had to put them back in 5th and 6th grade math. It happened all the time. I also know that these test scores that suburban schools want to brag about are totally bogus. I call up schools, I'll tell you about this in a minute, but sometimes I call up schools and say, hey, can I come visit? The answer is always no. And the second response that I get is, just look at our test scores. You don't have to come visit us, look at our test scores. We have the second highest test scores in the state, so on and so forth. We're a great suburban district. And yet, I had an elementary principal admit to me one time, from one of these great suburban districts, that most of her students come to school knowing how to read. Why? Because their mothers taught them. Or they went to a private, usually Christian school for kindergarten. That's why they come to school learning how to read. And that's why their test scores are high. When you rely on the school system to teach your children how to read, they may read if they have the kind of mind that has an internal verbal logic to it. They can figure things out just by knowing the alphabet. But about 40% of the time, that's not going to work. which is why we have 30 to 40% virtual illiteracy in this country right now. So at any rate, that's the scheme. The thing that I want to tell you before we get to the more heartening part of this presentation is anything that ever comes out of the mouth of a school superintendent or a school principal, and very often a politician who says that he's reforming the system, about how we're doing this program, or we're doing that program, or we're really changing this, or we're reforming that, it's not working. If it is a part of the regular school systems, it is not working. Because what they do learn how to do in education school is how to compromise anything that really is true learning, to change it, to repackage it, and then to sell it as something that's working. And it never does. Let me give you let me tell you about some of my visits to schools. So I call up schools, I ask if I can go in and see them. I don't tell them I'm in school reform, I don't tell them I'm in Hillsdale College. I just say, I'm a parent, and I want to know whether it'd be a good thing to move into your district. They don't like me to come in, but I usually get a walking tour, and sometimes they're foolish enough to hand me off to a student to take me on the walking tour. And the student will tell me everything that I need to know. And the counselors never know that that's going on. Messing around with other stuff. But here's the sort of thing that I'll see in a suburban school. A school that I've been assured is one of the best schools in the state. In this case, the state of Indiana, which is on the cutting edge of school reform. So you go into a first grade class, and the kids are supposedly learning phonics. Oh, first of all, you walk into the class, this is the first thing you notice. You don't have desks like this, with people facing the front of the class. Okay, that never happens in an elementary class. What you have are little pods. Group of 4 here, group of 4 here, group of 4 here, group of 4 here. You know what that means? That means the student's attention is never directed towards the front of the class. That means that the teacher is never teaching the class and doesn't even think that she is supposed to teach the class. What her job is, she thinks, is to set up nice little projects that the kids can work on. Lots of glue, lots of construction paper, and all that. And then her job is to flit around the classroom and to say, good job. Oh, that's so wonderful. To build up their self-esteem. It's not actually to teach them. There may be a few moments of the day where she is required by state law to do something that's called reading instruction. In fact, they might have a 90-minute reading block. In that 90-minute reading block, she may go over the alphabet a little bit. And she'll say something, she may even use a little of what I would call pseudo-phonics. And she'll tell the kids, you know, the letter A doesn't just have one sound, it has 2 sounds, class, and those sounds are A and A. Kids will say, wow, that's great, because they're kids, they want to learn stuff. The kids will go home and they'll tell their mommies, I learned that the letter A has 2 sounds, A and A, long A and short A. There's only one problem with that statement. The letter A has 4 sounds, maybe 5 sounds. A, aw. Have you ever heard of this thing in human life that most people have heard of called a father? That's not an A or an A, is it? So how does every elementary school in the country come across words like father that don't conform to that rule, and then pass off this bad information that the letter A only has 2 sounds? It means they don't know anything about human literacy or the English language. That's what it means. And so what they do when they come to a word like father that doesn't conform to that, or chalk, or talk, or any number of other words that you can find just by opening up any book, they say, oh, well, this is a sight word. Or even worse, they'll call it an outlaw word. This word doesn't conform to our stupid rule that we don't even know where we got it from. So we'll throw it up on the board and make it an outlaw. There is no word in the English language that ought to be an outlaw.
Thank you.
There's a reason behind every word, the way that it's spelled and the way that it's pronounced. There is a thing called phonics. And if these teachers were to be exposed to true phonics training, which would only take 3 days, they would know that. And they would know how to teach your children that. Because I've seen it done. I've seen teachers with no knowledge of phonics pick it up in a 3-day course and be able to go out and actually teach children how to read. But that, this whole A and A stuff, that's when they're actually trying to teach. I see much worse stuff than that. For example, I went into a 2nd grade class in which these students had a pre-spelled word for them, and they were writing it. They would write out the pre-spelled word, and then you know what they would do? Then they would go to a colored pencil, red, and they would trace over the pencil that they had just used, and then they would go to another pencil, purple, and trace over the word that they just used, and then they would go to their yellow, which you can't see very well, but they would trace over that. And I say, what are these students doing? And the teacher says, we're working on phonics. Really? And so what's this? Oh, those are rainbow words. Rainbow words. They're coloring words that have been spelled before them. They're not learning they're not learning the rules behind spelling. Across the table, because the kids are never doing the same thing in class. Across the table, you have another kid doing jumping jacks, spelling out words, pre-spelled for them. What are they doing? I asked the teacher. Phonics. These are jumping jack words. So because they're doing jumping jacks, they're somehow going to miraculously, not knowing the rules of spelling, learn how this word is spelled. Right? And I say, well, why would you even have doing that? Oh, we like integrating the curriculum. A little bit of health ed here, fine motor skills over here, all the rest of it. We have an integrated curriculum. That's bogus. And they should know that, but they don't. What else goes on? Well, I won't even tell you about math. It's too sad. History lesson. It's President's Day. And what they'll have, they love these mimeographs, that they download, by the way, from a website called greatteacherworksheet.com. So they take this blank slate, except for the fact that it has a frame in it. And their history lesson for the day is to draw a self-portrait. And then to write under the self-portrait with the 2 or 3 lines that are there, what I would do. This is written on the board, by the way, by the teacher. What I would do if I was president. Okay, if any of you know enough grammar to know what the subjunctive mood is, you know that they have just violated a principal rule of grammar. Meanwhile, the lady who was a secretary, who was giving me the tour, and one of the kids who is in 2nd grade, when I ask what the assignment is, says, and I say, what are you supposed to do? Oh, we're supposed to draw ourselves if we were president. So in other words, they get the grammar right. The 2nd grader and the secretary who's giving me the tour, and the teacher writes up across the board, scrawls, if I was president. What do they learn about existing real presidents? Nothing. It's their self-portrait. Do they know anything, do they learn anything on President's Day about who Washington was or who Lincoln was? President's Day used to not be President's Day. It used to be Washington's birthday and Lincoln's birthday. Do we learn anything about those presidents on President's Day? No, we draw a self-portrait. Because we're infatuated with ourselves and our own feelings and our own self-esteem, but we don't actually, we the teachers, have anything to instruct, to impart to these students about what the world is and what made it that way, and what made this country great. Well, that's at the elementary level. No, I gotta say one other thing. 2 other things. 3rd grade, reading block. What do I find going in the state-mandated 90-minute reading block? Which, by the way, all the politicians in Indiana are bragging about. I see a bunch of kids reading what are called leveled readers. They go up to the side of the class, they pull down a book, they read through this book, a book I've never heard of, doesn't look very good to me. There are hundreds of them. I've never heard of a single one of them. The kids read through it, takes about 15 minutes, then they answer 3 or 4 little questions, and they turn in their worksheet. What's the teacher doing? Walking up and down the aisle. So I asked the teacher, do you ever get together as a class and actually read a book together? So that maybe you could discuss it. And maybe the students would learn more about the book from you, the teacher. Answer, no. Oh, all these kids are at different reading levels. That's the answer. So what does that mean? That means that the bright kids get to read faster or higher level, and the not so bright kids get to read the lower level? How does that improve anybody's reading? Moreover, if the books are not substantive, and if the brighter reading kids are just reading through them and answering 3 simplistic questions, do they really actually read the books? Do they think about the books? Do they think about the characters and the human nature that's contained in those books? No. So I asked the third grade teacher, I say to her, do you ever sit down and just read a book with the kids together, a book like Alice in Wonderland? And I picked that title very purposely because it is a required reading in the core knowledge curriculum. Well, if a student wanted to read Alice in Wonderland, I guess the student could do that. But no, we don't read Alice in Wonderland. What that sounds like to me is we have the completely uninstructed and uneducated, i.e. the students, picking what they want to read. Shouldn't the schools know enough about education to tell the students what they ought to read and have something to say about what good literature is? So that they'll read these stories and they'll mean something in their lives? That's what I think education is. Meanwhile, in the 4th grade, this is one of my favorites, the students are doing, according to the state standards, they're working on biographies. This is a big thing for state standards. They'll say the state standard will say something like, students need to understand what the importance of biography is, so on and so forth. So what do you think the assignment is? The teacher takes out the assignment and shows you. One student here is interviewing this student here about his life and writing down what this student's biography is. Writing it down, writing it up, and then submitting it for a grade. I don't know about you, but I've actually never met an 8 or 9-year-old who had such an interesting life and was worthy of a biography. I think maybe Caesar, or Cicero, or Washington, or Lincoln, or Calvin Coolidge, or Ronald Reagan, or a host of people probably fit better into the biography category at the moment because their lives are more complete. And maybe if these children learned about those people's lives, they could live richer lives, which would one day warrant a biography. But if they're taught to be self-infatuated when they're in the 4th grade, what's the chances of their ever living that kind of life? Now that's not to say that they never do research. Research is a big thing. They love that. They love that one. On their own favorite people to do biographies of. And these are the things that get posted on the walls of schools. Go by, look what's up on the walls of schools sometime if you get the chance. I did. And who are the biographies of when they get to choose their own biography? Miley Cyrus, Tebow, Elvis, Michael Phelps, and Albert Einstein. There's one in every crowd. Some math people. Those are our schools are at the elementary level. We think everything's okay because the kids come home and the kids are so nice. If you ask the kids how was school today, oh, it was great, I loved it. They don't know anybody. How's your teacher? Oh, I love her, she's so nice. And she is nice. She's just not teaching them anything. Now, by the time you get to the middle school level, things start getting a little bit scary. Because then the kids are not so nice. They're bored, and they know it. And the sort of things that the teachers are trying to teach them, they're just not paying. We spend a lot of time on middle school, but I think everybody knows that middle school is not working in this country. I very often hear middle school referred to as the zoo, the jungle, and a host of other things that suggest that discipline is not first on the minds of those who are there. How about high school? Supposedly we have better teachers at the high school. We have better classes, AP, IB, all these letters. Well, let me tell you what happens when I go into a high school class. This, by the way, is in a great school, I'm told. High test scores and all the rest of it. Well, I'll go into a world history class, sophomores. And I'll ask the teacher, world history, you teach that in 1 year? Yeah. The whole history of the world in 1 year. I said, that's a big chunk. That's a lot of history to teach. How do you manage that? Oh, it's hard, but we get it done. So I say, okay, well tell me, what do you do with the Greeks in world history? Presumably you have some Greek history. How long do you spend on it? Oh, week and a half. Okay, come on. What do you teach? Are there any wars that you might teach? And here I start trying to beat the question. You know, wasn't there this war between Athens and Sparta? I mean, it was really bad. There was this guy named Pericles or something. They don't know I'm a history professor. I'm looking for the word Peloponnesian. The teacher says, oh yeah, there were a lot of wars in Greece. She doesn't know. She doesn't have a clue what the war between Athens and Sparta was that ruined, that destroyed the Greek world as we knew it. So, she doesn't answer that. So I say, well, what do you do with Greece? Oh, we divide up into two different teams, this group over here and this group over here, and they work on their skits, and they come together, and we have a skit on the Olympics. Really? 16-year-olds? Now, I don't want to put her on the spot there, and I also don't want to blow my cover, but I do have a few questions about the Olympics in a room that's 20 by 20. Number one, how do you reproduce the javelin throw or the discus? Number two, do the males exercise naked as they did in the real Olympic Games? Number three, are the girls banned from the room as they were in the real Olympic Games? And if they were caught sneaking into the Olympics, they would be thrown from the rocks in order to keep them out. You do those things. Is that part of your skit? I think the answer is no. Which means their knowledge of even the Olympics, even if we were to say that what the Greek world was really about, it wasn't about democracy, it wasn't about philosophy, it wasn't about Socrates, it wasn't about Pericles or the Peloponnesian War, it was just about the Olympics. Even if that were a worthy educational choice to make, these kids don't learn anything about the real Olympic Games. They have their own makeshift, project-based Olympic Games. That's what's taught in education school. I go up to, two more things, I'm getting carried away here. I go up to the AP government class teacher. This is AP. You get college credit if you take the AP exam and if you make a certain grade on it. So this is supposed to be the equivalent of a college level class. And I asked this AP, advanced placement, American government teacher, whether they read any primary sources, any real sources, any primary documents. Oh yeah, there are a lot in the book, he says. Okay, so what that means is, at the bottom of the page, there might be half a page of some great thinker. There might be a cutout of a Federalist paper or something like that. That's what they're getting, a snippet. And so I asked the question, give me an example of a primary document. Oh, well, there was this guy, this French guy, his name was Tocqueville, and he wrote this piece called The Tyranny of the Majority, and we read that for the anti-Republican side, for the anti-Republican point of view. Okay. This person is supposedly teaching a class at the college level. Number one, this French guy, Alexis de Tocqueville, came to America, wrote one of the greatest books on American democracy. It was not called The Tyranny of the Majority. It was called Democracy in America. Tyranny of the Majority is just one of the things that he treats in the book, and that was just the heading that was clearly in that book. Secondly, he is not writing from the anti-Republican point of view. He has critical things to say about democracy, but he is a lover of liberty, and one of the greatest lovers of liberty in the history of political thought. So this fellow who's supposedly teaching this class at the college level has no idea what he's talking about. That's in a great school district in the hardest class that you can take. Okay. Well, at any rate, that's with all the reforms that you can talk about. That's with a superintendent of public instruction who was just kicked out. His name was Tony Bennett. That's with a Republican governor, one of the most respected in the state, Mitch Daniels. That's with school reforms coming out of the legislature. That's with a district that says, oh yeah, we're conforming to state standards. That's with all of that stuff going on. And if you actually get into the classroom, there is no learning going on. The students who come out of the school with high test scores and things like that are either learning it on their own or they're just really smart. And remember, they came to school knowing how to read. They're not getting it from the school. The 1,000 hours every year that they spend in school are pretty much a waste of time. And not 10% of those hours are worth anything. Now, there are occasionally good teachers in schools. And I've met such teachers, and I don't want to say that that's not the case. But they are there in spite of their instruction, in spite of the system, and they will be the first ones to tell you that the place that they're working in is not serious. And that if they could go to some place that were serious, they would be there in a heartbeat. Now, sorry, I just can't help dancing. At any rate, so what do we do about it? Well, there are a couple of things you can try. For those of you, how many people are still in the room who are elected school board officials? Okay, I commend you. You have one virtue, at least, and that virtue is courage. Whether you have prudence or not, I do not know. Because you've exposed your life to a lot of turmoil, and you've made a great stand in your district. The question that you have to ask yourself is, what is your role? Because everybody I've ever talked to who's in your position eventually gets extremely frustrated because you're in the minority, you get outvoted. Every time there's an election, if you can actually win re-election, you're painted as the anti-teacher candidate. The unions hate you, and anything that you try to do is going to be explained away by a superintendent, or you're going to be told we're already doing that. So, I don't know what your chances are of achieving real reform. I just don't know. But I do know what is true is that you have an elected position and you have a voice right now. And the best thing that you can do is use your position to go into classrooms, which you should be able to do. Maybe even invite people who know things about schools to go into classrooms and observe these things and make sure that people understand in your district that the kids are not really getting educated. Now you have to be prudent about how you say those things. You can't just get up in front of the school board and say, these teachers are just, they don't know anything. If you make that kind of a statement, you're going to turn people off. But if you craft your statement in such a way that to say that I don't think our teacher training really prepares these teachers to teach real subjects. And by the way, I've looked at these standards, they don't seem very substantive to me. And when I go into the classrooms, I don't see that they're actually reading books. If you could say things like that to draw attention to it, there may be a whole bunch of people in your community who would want to hear those things. You may be blackballed, I don't know how it goes. But it is the truth. And education reform in this country has to begin with the truth. And the truth is children are not being educated. And that needs to be spelled out. And just saying, well, we put this standard in or we put that standard in, that doesn't happen. The second thing I would say to you is don't let yourself go down rabbit holes. Committees that go on for a year and a half on stupid things such as, well, does the 6th grade belong in the middle school or does the 6th grade belong in the elementary school? What are we to do about this adolescent issue? What are we to do about the adolescent piece? I don't know if you've noticed this yet, but educators love to take the noun piece and attach it to almost anything, like the learning piece, the teaching piece, the discipline piece. Where did this come from? It's mumbo jumbo. At any rate, I can tell you in 5 minutes what the issue is in 6th grade. And having a committee waste its time for an entire year to determine whether it belongs here or belongs there, that's not what it's about anyway. They just want to reconfigure the buildings because they don't know where to house people. And they want to make it look like it's an education center. They also want to take you off on a rabbit trail so that you don't actually look at what's going on in the classroom. That's what almost all these task forces, all these committees that go on in school districts, that's what they are. They're a ruse to make it look as though the school board is doing something and the district is doing something. But those are not real answers. The other thing that I would say is the best thing that you can do is to educate yourself about what a good education is. It means reading some books, reading some of the classics on what a good education is, classics in education reform. There aren't a ton of them, I'll admit. But books by E.D. Hirsch, Cultural Literacy, What Our Children Need to Know and Why They Don't Know It, that's it. Other things like that, some of the things that are well liked in the homeschooling community. Those are worth reading because they are trying, sometimes doing a very good job of it, of getting back to what education is supposed to be. I've written a bunch of articles that are read all over the place. Some of them are on our website. Those might be helpful to you as well. A lot of people have told me that they are. But informing yourself about what solid education really is will help you so that when you go into these board meetings, you can understand how all the gobbledygook that they're talking about is not education, and how the things that you have to talk about, really, those things are education. How am I doing on time?
Probably move into questions in about 4 minutes.
Okay, so let me scope out for you, maybe only in 10 or 15 minutes, the sort of things that you should see in a real school. Let's start from the ground like we did just now. 1st grade. Real phonics. Now it's a complex argument to tell you what real phonics is, but the fact is there are only 2 or 3 programs out there that are any good. There's one called the Riggs program, which we like a lot. There's another called Spalding, which we like a lot. But basically a real phonics program is one that has basic, it starts with 45 different phonemes of the English language. These are the letters, obviously, and all the different ways in which the letters are pronounced. And then also groups of letters that come together, such as O-U-G-H, UF, or O, if you think about though, or tough. These are groups, packages of letters you might think of them that are phonemes. If you have a phonics program that starts with those 45 phonemes and teaches them explicitly, and then examines words in light of those phonemes, that's a real phonics program. The surest indication of knowing when you don't have a phonics program is when you have this cop-out such as outlaw words, read to know words, or sight word, all that stuff. That means that it's not a real phonics program. And I admit that some of the districts are real good about finding these Mickey Mouse pseudo-phonics programs, and guess what? They come to you in really big publishers, like McGraw-Hill and what have you. They're making millions of dollars and passing off programs that are not really phonics as phonics. What else? Well, the kids, even at an early age, should be reading good literature and having good literature read to them. Why shouldn't they know the classics? My wife, who's homeschooling our oldest boy right now, who's 7½, my wife and my boy are reading Farmer Boy by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And my wife just loves Laura Ingalls Wilder, but some of the books are told more from a girl's perspective, as you probably remember from the Little House series. Farmer Boy is a great book for boys. That's the sort of thing that you should be reading in the classroom. By the time you get up to the 4th or 5th grade, the curriculum that we work with, the core knowledge curriculum, in the 4th grade, they read Robinson Crusoe, an adapted version of it. They read, what are some of the other ones? Pollyanna. They read, let's see, in the 5th grade, they read The Real Thing, Frederick Douglass's narrative, his autobiography. That's in 5th grade. I never saw that until I was in college. they begin reading Shakespeare in the 5th grade. That's the sort of thing that should be going on in your schools. What the schools will tell you nowadays is that they're adding more nonfiction to the curriculum. That's another rabbit hole. What they call nonfiction is a bunch of schlock that they've got together, really stupid stories. What they're trying to do is outguess the state tests. If your kids are starting to read Shakespeare in the 5th and 6th grade, trust me, they will do well on any state-mandated tests. Because the state tests themselves are fixed. There's no way that they can have 90% of the state fail. If they did, they would be out of business. So they have to fix the tests in such a way that in suburban districts, the majority of the kids are going to pass. So all this hand-wringing and apprehension about whether we're going to do well on the state test, I never had my teachers look a minute at the state test or the state standards. I said, follow the curriculum, we'll do fine on the tests. First year of the school, 3rd grade, number one in the city, number 10 in the state. That was just after 1 year of teaching phonics, reading real stuff. So don't worry about those things. I know that the superintendents will always say, well, we got to look at it. You don't have to. If you're reading real things, this data-driven instruction business is a total farce. The kids should not be behind computers, by the way. The whole testing industry has actually, in some ways, helped out teachers and teachers' unions. You notice when state tests first came in, all the teachers were worried, you're going to make us teaching to the test. That language is actually starting to go away. You know why? Because districts are buying really expensive computers. And the teachers are doing this. This is their way to teach. Okay, Johnny, you sit here. Let's click this and this. Okay, I'll come back and see how you're doing in 45 minutes. How is that teaching? It's not. It's clicking in the computer. It's not teaching.
Is that an audio of a teacher?
No, that is a program that the district has bought that's really expensive that takes them through these kind of mind games that are predicting what the state tests are going to be. That's what that is. And I submit to you that a better way of training the mind, there's a movie now out called Lincoln. I don't know, it was pretty good, but Daniel Day-Lewis, who's a great method actor, was actually playing Lincoln. So I was watching this as I was eating breakfast this morning. And the snippet that I saw had Lincoln talking about math, specifically Euclid, and thinking about how the principles that are in Euclid, where something that's the same is always the same, something that's equal is always equal. He's taking that logic and bringing it out and applying it to the big question that was before America at that time, which is equality, as guaranteed in the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln didn't have a laptop. Lincoln had a bunch of books, and he was pretty much self-taught. I think that kind of
Shakespeare.
What's that?
And he focused on Shakespeare.
He focused on Shakespeare. He focused on fables. He liked Euclid. He liked the King James Bible, and he read Thomas Jefferson backwards and forward. That's pretty much Lincoln's curriculum. And it's not complete. There's some things we could add. Lincoln read everything. But even in his youth, he read those things. If we could have that in the schools nowadays, I think we would know a little bit more about self-government. I think we'd know a little bit more about liberty. And we wouldn't have such angst when it came to vote nowadays about what the principles of this country really are. At any rate, what else should you see? Oh, here's the other thing that's going on in the schools. Under the guise of prepping for the test, we're getting rid of music. We're getting rid of art. There are a lot of elementary schools that do music once a week and art once every other week. Now, the quality of the art that they do is actually probably not that good because art's been dumbed down as well. And I don't know what the quality of the music is. But I will say this. If you think we're at a time in our history where we need less beauty and less understanding of what the beautiful is, you're profoundly misreading the times. I think if we understood a little bit more about what is beautiful in life, in our culture we're infused with a little bit more of the beautiful, Once again, we wouldn't have such angst during election times. We also wouldn't want to watch some of the schlock that's on television. So at any rate, that's the sort of thing you should see. Math? Well, you shouldn't see a bunch of kids pushing calculators, I'll tell you that much. And you should see kids who can add, mainly because they're working on real mathematics. Math is the hardest thing to do in schools. And you know why it's the hardest thing to do? It's because the teachers aren't very good at it. Even less so than they are at English. They are math phobes themselves. What that means is, when they're teaching math class, they go to greatteacherworksheet.com. They print it out, they hand it to the students, and that's about all the math you get. But there's no teaching of math. To have good math instruction, you actually have to train the teachers in what math is. That's what has to happen. We have to do it in our schools, and it is the hardest thing to do. Of all the other subjects that get taught. Phonics is really easy. Math is hard.
Are you speaking of all grades or just the lower grades?
Well, here, I'm speaking of the lower grades, but let me tell you about the upper grades. A few years back, this famous mathematician, whose name I forget, sorry, but who is at Caltech in California. Y'all ever heard of Caltech? You ever watched The Big Bang Theory? Okay, well that's based on, these are supposedly professors at Caltech. These are the geniuses in the math business. And this fellow who was the chairman of the math department at Caltech, who was actually asked by the city of Los Angeles to look at their math standards. He wrote an article a few years back, in the 90s I think, complaining that his students coming into math at Caltech, of all places, whereas when he first started teaching, every one of them knew how to do a geometric proof. Nowadays, a minority, something like 20 to 30% of the students have ever encountered a geometric proof. So what that means is, all this talk about STEM and math and getting kids into calculus and AP, that's all bogus. What's happened is the mathematics has been taken out of the mathematics. Now, I'm not enough of a math person to explain this, but we have a math professor at Hillsdale who looks at math books and he can't stand it. If you just open one up, I mean, this is math. This is not even so-called social studies, but if you open up a math book, you will think that you have just turned on MTV. Colors, this, that, gimmicks, you name it, it's not math. So who are the kids who actually do well in math? The kids who, like the kids who learn how to read, have an intuitive understanding of numbers and love that stuff. Those kids they don't get a good math education, but at least they can kind of teach themselves all the way through and use the books as best they can. The kids who don't get a good math education are the people like me, who are not intuitively good with math, and who, once you get up to algebra, where it starts becoming very theoretical and it's not just computational, you just wonder, why are we using letters now instead of numbers? It was not until I ran a school that I understood, though I had taken the course in high school, I did not understand that trigonometry had anything to do with triangles. I'm serious. All we did was sine and cosine and punch a bunch of numbers on our calculator. There were no graphs. And think about the word trigonometry, the measurement of triangles. Kids don't know that. So that's what's going on in math, to be frank. Foreign languages, walk into a foreign language class sometime. See if the kids are actually speaking the foreign language. See if the teacher is speaking the foreign language. There's really only one way to teach a foreign language, a modern foreign language, and that is by speaking the language to the children. Now, for grammar, maybe you have to explain it in English. I'll grant you that. But the rest of the period should be taken up in conversation. How did you learn to speak English? By your parents speaking it to you. There's no different. There's no different principle when you learn a language later. And what the teachers would say, oh, they're too uncomfortable with that, or no, they're not quite there yet. And so what does foreign language end up becoming? A whole bunch of cultural studies. Let's break a piñata today on Cinco de Mayo and eat some sopapillas. And let's learn the accent, sopapillas. but did they learn how to ask any question beyond where is the bathroom? No. Usually because the teachers themselves do not know the language. That's flat out. Spanish, sometimes that's not the case. But French, you can't find very many French teachers in this country who actually know French. German, no way. So, what do you do? How do you avoid that problem? I keep dwelling on the negative. How do you get around that problem? Hire French teachers who know French. It's that simple. It's not that hard, and they may be Francophones. They may be French themselves. Of course, they're Francophones. We may have to hire German people.
What do you think about the focus away from Latin?
I'm against it.
Why Latin over other languages?
Sorry?
Why Latin over other languages? Same.
Well, I would say that every student needs to know Latin, and at least needs to know 1 to 2 years of it. Now this sounds totally countercultural. Latin? Here we're worried about a 21st century global economy, and you want to teach a dead language like Latin? Well, this is actually so easy to knock out of the park, it's unbelievable. 60% of the words of the English language come from Latin. So if you've taken even a spattering of Latin, if you've had a month of Latin, you have insights into the English language that most people who speak English don't. For example, lesson 1, day 1, is probably something like Huela pulchra est, which if you know any Latin, that simply means the girl is beautiful. This is also a great pickup line. You can sell it to the boys. I mean, homeschooling girls and charter school girls, they fall for this one every time. But let's think about that. Huela pulchra est. There is a word in the English language, it is pulchritude, which means beauty, that almost no one knows. And the reason they don't know it is because you don't turn on the television and hear people talking about pulchritude. Even some of the words that we do use that people don't understand what they mean come straight out of Latin. You notice this is my favorite word to follow during any election, especially during the primaries. The question is always asked, does this candidate have gravitas? Well, gravitas comes from the Latin from which we get gravity, which means weight. It means weightiness, steadiness of character. Gravitas is a virtue in the Roman world. And that's the way that they describe their statesmen. Statesmen who did not have gravitas, they never became statesmen, because that was the demeanor you were supposed to have. A tough, stoical Roman. So you can get insights into your own culture. We still use these words. But what's even more important, maybe the ultimate thing, is that once you introduce words like frugalitas, frugality, gravitas, virtus. Does anybody know what the word virtus means in Latin? Virtue. The word virtue comes from the Latin virtus, but here's the tricky part. Virtus in Latin comes from the Latin word vir, or man. So when the Romans described virtue, what they were really saying was manliness. They weren't just saying, be a good person or be nice. That's not what they were saying. They were saying that the man who has virtues is himself a man. This is what defines a man, virtue. And I think that would be a pretty good lesson for 13-year-old boys. And in any middle school I've ever had anything to do with it, that's when they start Latin, 6th grade. Maybe they could start a little bit before. Yes, ma'am.
You want me to give you a testimonial about I must be old enough, older than everybody else, because I had Latin in high school. Best subject I ever took in my life. So useful, so helpful. It made my English easy. I could go to Europe and figure out the French words, figure out the Spanish words, even though I never studied French and Spanish. It just was the most useful, helpful high school course I had. For my entire life.
Right. Let me add something to that, and then I'm gonna say one more thing, and then I want to open this thing up for questions, because you all probably have a lot I have heard that statement from ladies just like you 100 times. One time I was at church and people knew what I did. This was out in Colorado. This lady came up to me and said, "Well, what is a classical education?" And I started trying to explain it. And this lady said, "Well, you know, I didn't have a classical education. I just went to a one-room schoolhouse out on the the eastern side of the plains of Colorado. And we had Latin, and we had orthography." Have you ever heard that word, orthography? It actually means like orthodox. It means the science of correct spelling. That's phonics. That's what we used to call spelling, orthography. So, and the point that y'all are making, that my colleague here made from the very beginning, is when people, the word classical, especially in a public school setting, sounds really either hoity-toity or just, you know, you're living in the past. But to explain to parents what a classical education is, all you have to say is, this is the education that your grandparents would have. It's really that simple. And it works. All the great things that were invented for us, a lot of technology and all the rest of it, that stuff actually came out of the classical mind. By the way, now, this is not somebody I refer to all the time. I don't even know his name. But he had a movie made about him. He was the founder of Facebook. What's this fellow's name? Zuckerberg.
Yeah.
Do you know what his favorite book is? The Aeneid. He actually knows Latin. He also knows Greek. I think he even knows Hebrew. Because he went to a really, really swanky private school. His father taught him computers. From the school, he got books like the Aeneid. So don't tell me that the modern world of technology does not need that sort of education. That's bogus. But the one thing that I want to say, and especially coming from Hillsdale, and especially in this particular transitional period in our Commonwealth, the thing that these students need to be learning is what this country is, what this country stands for, what the founding fathers themselves said about what a nation looks like, what Lincoln himself said about what a nation ought to look like, rather than having sometimes extremely negative, cocky, unknowing teachers putting words into the founding fathers' mouth and saying, "Oh yeah, they were all a bunch of racists," or "they were all a bunch of sexists," or "they didn't know what it meant to live in a modern world." What they need to know is what this country stands for. Because the principles on which this country was created are right and true and show us what the best hope is for human beings in living together. We have much to learn from the founding fathers. Not just kids in school, but people who get into elected office and ordinary citizens need to understand what the foundings have to teach to us. They encountered problems very similar to us, and they had answers to those problems. And our innovations, when it comes to the science of government, have not helped us. And the students also have to know that over the course of our history, starting really in 1912, exactly 100 years ago, came a moment in this country when elected leaders in office started attacking the Declaration of Independence, started attacking the Constitution. And I'm not making this up because it's in their speeches. And so I'm not suggesting that you teach a partisan education. I am suggesting that you teach what people actually said and did in their lives. The thing that is common in high school history curriculum is that you do all of American history in the 7th and 8th grade. You get up into the high school around 11th grade, after they've had their astonishingly great tour de force, world history in the 10th grade, where they've learned about Greece and the Greek Olympics. Then in the 11th grade, they have American history. But you know where American history starts usually in the 11th grade? 20th century. They don't study the Founding Fathers as more mature students, so they don't get to read the Declaration of Independence. They don't get to read the Constitution. They start with progressives. And they start with the idea, they don't even talk about the 19th century, they start with the idea that there were these bad old money-grubbing investor types, whom we call robber barons, who made a whole bunch of money, more money than they ever deserved. And the poor were just getting poorer the whole time. And so the progressives came in there, and hallelujah, they passed things like the progressive income tax, which started out, you know what the original, I'm getting sidetracked here, but do you know what the original rate was, the highest marginal rate on the income tax in 1914 after it was passed in 1914?
1%.
What's that?
7.
It was 7%. Certain incomes got taxed at 1%, and then it was progressive, so the highest rate would be 7%. What member of the 1% nowadays wouldn't give his right arm for a 7% income? By the end of World War I, after a bunch of bills had been run up, I forget the exact number, but I think it's up in the high 60s, maybe 70%. I mean, if you look at the chart,
Up to 90%.
if you look at the chart, starting from 1914 all the way down through the Reagan administration, through today, if you look at the highest marginal rates, what you'll see is, whereas in 1914, if you made over $500,000 a year, $500,000 a year in 1914, that's a lot of money. That's when you would be taxed at 7%. What do they start doing? They bring that marginal rate down, and then they take the tax rate up. And there are actually two changes to that. Two things that break the course of that. That's Calvin Coolidge in the 1920s. That's Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And if you chart economic growth in light of tax rates, you'll find that the two biggest booms in American history occurred during the Calvin Coolidge administration and during the Ronald Reagan administration. Students won't ever get that information because it's not presented in textbooks. And they may not even hear anything about the Founding Fathers because it's not in the textbooks. So I think, at the very least, as responsible citizens, for you serving on the school board, or you who are citizens who are bringing your district to task, as you're trying that, you ought to ask the question, why can't we at least teach the whole story in the 11th grade? And do they have access, and will they be taught the actual words of the Founding Fathers? Or will they read it through some sort of cycle, some sort of interlocutor who changes the words of the Founding Fathers? And take a look at the textbooks. And the way you can know whether the textbooks are biased or not is very simple. Go to the FDR, say what they say about him, what they call him is a pragmatist. Oh, he just inherited this awful economy. He was a pragmatist. He wasn't an ideologue. He was just doing what was right. He was figuring out what had to be done. Compare that with some of his speeches. Just do it. He is not simply a pragmatist. And then you just skip straight ahead to the 1980s and look at what they do with Reagan. They'll refer to Reagan not as a pragmatist, but a man with a few simple ideas, i.e., he's a dummy, who somehow got this incredible economic boom, but we're not going to talk about that. What we're going to talk about is AIDS and the gap between the rich and the poor, which supposedly occurred during the Reagan administration, which is not true. And there's one other thing that I forget. What's that? Oh, and Iran-Contra. So in other words, yeah, Carter was a bad president, and we had this simplistic cowboy former actor who got into office. And yeah, the economy improved a little bit, but let's talk about AIDS. Is that the story of Ronald Reagan? So that will tell you right now what's being taught in class, because I can guarantee you that the teachers themselves are so unsure about their history. In 9 out of 10 cases, they're not going to go anywhere beyond what the textbook says, unless to just chime in and say, yeah, I remember Reagan, that guy just didn't know anything. Do they log on to YouTube and actually show a Ronald Reagan speech? How about the 1964 Goldwater speech? There is no way that any human being can watch the entirety of that speech and come away thinking Reagan was a dummy. He wrote it, he had no speechwriters, and that speech is as living today as it ever was. That's the sort of thing that you can try to see, open up the discussion by saying, why don't they get to see this?
How about the Washington farewell address?
Absolutely. All right, I've talked for a long time. Let me just open it up to general questions right now, and we'll go as much as we can. Yes, sir.
One of the reasons I'm here is basically a lot of things that you've just presented with arguments that I can actually take to the voters, that I can actually go in and do an analysis and be able to make a presentation back to the voters as the things that need to be done. Do you have, I'm going to say, a seminar training where if I were to be on the school board, I could take teachers and send them here to a program where you say, okay, here is what you're doing. Like as example, I can send my math teachers to you, I can send my English teachers to you, and you would have a boot camp for them. Do you have anything like that? Are you developing anything like that?
We are working with, that word boot camp is interesting because we're going to have that for principals in July for the first time. And we're not sure who's going to come to that boot camp. Our project right now is working for these charter schools that we're helping to launch. Mr. Kilgore?
Yeah, there is, let me point you towards something that could be helpful. In the course of this work with the charter schools that we do, we bring them to our campus and have a seminar and talk very specifically about a lot of these types of things. The lectures that we have at those seminars, we video record them, and they're available today. We've had this, given that this initiative launched 3 years ago. We had a seminar in 2011 and also in 2012, and all of the lectures that were presented there are video recorded, and you can get to them on our website. In fact, on the piece of paper that I handed out is a reference to our website. Just scroll around there. There's only 4 or 5 pages to talk about charter school initiative, and one of the folks that came to that first seminar we had in 2011 immediately went back, and even though it was really geared toward leadership and founders and school board members and so forth, the principals, he wanted to use that for teacher training, and he did, because all the videos were there. So that's one resource that I'd be happy for you to avail yourself of. They're right on our website today.
Let me tell you about 2 more that I think might be helpful. One is something that's not associated with the charter school thing, but it's what Hillsdale puts on, has had going for a long time. These things are called CTEs, and that stands for Center for Teacher Excellence, Center for Teaching Excellence, or something like that. And these are always geared towards history and civics teachers, usually at the high school level. And what happens is a day will be set aside, a Saturday or something like that, and usually 3 Hillsdale professors come in, often political science, sometimes history professors. I've done these before. And they'll spend a whole day in training with a district's high school teachers, high school civics teachers. So that sort of thing, I'm not the one who runs the CTE. You have to get in contact with those folks. I'm sure you can find that on our website or Dr. Kilgore.
Yeah, if you wanted to look for that information, again on the Hillsdale College website under seminars, you can just search on it, CTE or Center for Teacher Excellence. We hold a couple of those a year, and usually one of them is on the Hillsdale campus, which is not a bad drive from you folks here. Otherwise, it might be somewhere else around the country.
One other thing that I'll tell you about, which is even in some ways a more permanent solution, at least for history and civics teachers. And this doesn't come from Hillsdale. They're they're not rivals of us. They're fellow travelers of us. But Ashland University, where I used to teach, which is right here in your state, they have a master's program for history and civics teachers that you can go through during the summer. And a bunch of our professors come down and teach these week-long classes that are given real master's degrees. I think you have to go through about 3 or 4 summers worth. And so since teachers usually in the state of Ohio, I think, have to get so many credits, to keep their certification alive and all this continuing education stuff, which is almost always totally useless. That counts for this. So if you could service, it counts for in-service and for continuing education and boost your pay scale and all the rest of it. So if you had some folks who really wanted to get interested in that, I think they would be happy to have more applicants. And that's right here, that's in your own back door. And I think they have probably 200 different teachers in that program. It's a big thing they do during the summer, and the folks who've been through it really love it. Yes, sir.
Is there anything within the Hillsdale program that we can look at? Well, let me go back here a minute. When somebody goes to work at a bank, the way they teach new bank tellers how to find what is a counterfeit bill is they show them what the real bill looks like.
Right.
I.e., anything that doesn't look like this is counterfeit. Is there anything that I'm not educated enough, like you and several other folks here in this room, but what can I do, what can I tell that is not what we're looking for? Is there any kind of a program graphic or?
Okay, well, I'll give you a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is this. It's my favorite thing, I can send you to. First 2 or 3 paragraphs of chapter 4, Kill a Mockingbird. How many of you read To Kill a Mockingbird in high school? How many of you remember that the first couple of chapters are actually about how poor her education was? Actually, not very many people know that. Because they don't, this is one of my pet peeves. You don't actually read literature in English class. You learn stupid plot structures, rising action, falling action. This is a deep character, this is not. That's all garbage. That's not what books are about. If you go back and read the second chapter and the first few paragraphs of chapter 4, you will see described the beginnings of progressive education. And especially in that chapter 4, she has this funny, tragic comment where she says that miles and miles of construction paper were being wasted by the state of Alabama to teach them good citizenship. And if you see that going on in your schools, particularly in the elementary schools, that's not learning. And all the other sort of things that I described are not learning. Now, you're an elected school board.
We're looking at wanting to run for school board.
You're looking at running for school board. Well, get on the board, and then once you get on the board, I can tell you, or you can invite me in. You could get me into your schools. I could go in and take a look, and I could give you a report. But the things that I described are the things that you need to familiarize yourself. The other thing that I would say is go to a good school. Go to a good school, and it might have to be a private school, or once we get some schools up here in the state of Ohio, we can let you go to one of our schools, and we're happy to have you sit in. And then you compare that to what you see elsewhere. If you're willing to take a trip, we can tell you some places you can go to see what ought to be going on. Yes, sir.
My background is a CPA with very large international professional services firms. And when I look at schools, what they really are, or should be, is a professional service organization with teachers being professionals. And the key to success of any professional organization really is to be able to hire, support, and reward the people with, good teachers, good superintendents, and good principals, and to terminate and or cancel out the mediocre or poor teachers. Is there a path that we can learn to, how do you hire and reward and support the good teachers?
It's actually not that hard. Let me tell you what you have to do. First of all, is you've identified all the problems with teacher tenure. But the biggest problem is certification. And that's what makes even coming into your state trying to do a charter school, which is completely autonomous from the school district. That makes that hard because we still have to draw on people who've been through all this certification malarkey. So that means basically you're counting on finding people who held their nose and did their requirements and hated it the whole time, but they so much wanted to be a teacher they were willing to put up with that nonsense. And they didn't do the obvious thing, which is just forget that and go teach in private school. So there are very few people out there who come out of these departments who are really good. So from a political standpoint, the thing that we always try to push is Get rid of certification. Now, if you're on a school board, my understanding is in most states that you can have provisional licenses, you can do a whole bunch of things to skirt the certification requirement. You actually have more power sometimes in charter schools. And if you make the argument, look, we're not getting the math teachers we want, that's usually an easy argument to make, but you can also say, we're not even getting the English teachers we want. We think that communication will be something very important in the 21st century. Because most of our employees are coming to us and saying, our kids can't read or talk or speak, or our employees. They can't even read a memo and understand what it says. That is an argument for saying, well, let's get some highly qualified, don't use the certified, but highly qualified English people, some of them who are career changers, to get them into our schools. If you can get a waiver like that going on in your school district, and you get those sort of people in, then that can be an education in itself. The other thing I would do is, in your district, promote school choice. Because it's hard in some places to get schools approved. Places like Worthington, they're not so happy to have a really good school come into their community and then serve as a model for what the school can be like. But if you can push that on the board, and you can actually, from a board perspective, be friendly to charter schools, then you have, in a way, the opportunity to say, look what they're doing over here. Why shouldn't the district do more of that? If you think the district can be sound. As far as hiring superintendents, that's very simple. As you get all the applications in, anytime you see EDD after their name, strike them from the list. And say, we're just doing what every other school district in the country is doing. And those schools aren't any good, we know it. Why don't we hire somebody who actually knows something about education? Now, how many people would apply actually to be the superintendent of schools who wasn't a part of that system? I don't know. But
What kind of background should the superintendent have?
Probably a headmaster at a classical school or a private school that's really good. That'd be the thing I would look for. Somebody who has experience at the school level and who can talk about reading and writing and grammar. Who's hired employees, who's fired employees. But somebody who's not from that system.
What about a business background?
You know, the problem with hiring somebody, a lot of times you'll get people with a business background who have all the right intentions. But because they don't know the lingo, the establishment itself has so much that it can talk about and it can weigh them down with standards and you get into a discussion about special ed and they start throwing these acronyms at you. You can just be blasted. And then if your tendency is to want to compromise anyway, you don't know enough to be able to stand on principle. If you could find somebody who had a business background but who had also spent some time in school and had learned all this, and had learned what a good education looks like, that could be a good person. But first of all, you've got to find that person. Secondly, you've got to get the rest of the school board to hire that person. And I do know of places where that's been tried. And even these Reform Road board members think they have the votes lined up the night before, and you get into the vote and people cave. So I urge you to try that.
Well, what about a process to, and I don't know if you guys are involved in this or what, but a process to find good people that could be great, have the qualities to be a great superintendent, and then teach them a lot of this education lingo and other things.
Well,
if you could run a huge business, with $500 million in sales, it seems to me, the revenue, it seems to me that that's somebody you could really teach a lot of this lingo to if they had an interest and get those kind of people into education.
Let me tell you what we're doing right now. We're starting schools all over the country. We have 2 started, we'll have 4 next year, we'll probably have 5 the next year. And we are beating, what do you call it, beating the paths, beating the bushes. We're beating the bushes to find headmasters for those schools. There aren't that many out there who would be good at it. That's the truth. So to say, okay, let's find a whole bunch of great superintendents who would have to go in and face an entire school board and the school establishment. That's even harder. We're just getting into that, whether it turns into something like that, whether we may be in that business or not, I don't know. But that's very tough. I hope you understand how hard it is to reform a school system from within.
Like what he was saying there with regards to glossary of terms, do you have something that can give us glossary of terms? Because I'm one of those same individuals. A lot of us do not understand some of the lingo.
You know, I've come across, 2 minutes, I've come across, I think if you Google, something like school lingo for dummies or something like that, there are actually people who are on the good side of things, who have written glossaries that do that very thing. Because that's what they do, they just wear you down with all this lingo. And if you can see through the lingo, you know that it's half of it's nonsense. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. In the private sector, we have management resource planning where we're promoting from within and building our knowledge that way. How does that work in the schools?
I'll try to explain that. And this is the hard.
Is it a good thing, first of all?
I'm telling you that it's very hard. What you would do is, if you would like to promote from within, but that means you have to have a good school that's already in place. And then within that good school, you look at not just people who are teachers who may be perfectly fine in the classroom, you have to find somebody who can take the helm and actually lead the thing. Now, when I left the school out in Colorado, they had a principal search, and it was hard. And they did promote somebody from within. One of the best teachers in the school. He had a hard time being a school principal. It was not what he was cut out for. I mean, I think he's done a pretty good job, but he did it for 4 or 5 years, and he's stepping down, and they had to go through the same thing again. So, I mean, look, I think if anything, if this last week has taught us anything, it's that in America there is currently a crisis of leadership.
Yes.
Now, if that is the case, why would that be any different in schools than it is in the political ranks?
So we have a superintendent that actually came up from the ranks. I mean, who was part of that
If you could
system.
find, if you could,
Is that a good thing?
no, if he's been in the system, he's going to be awful. You have to get somebody from outside the system. It would be better to go with a businessman than to go somebody with an EDD. That's why I'm saying, you get these resumes and they talk about how they've already been a superintendent here, and how they did this here, and how they were on this task force here, and you watch their career trajectories. If they're part of that system, you don't want those people. So it's better to have somebody from the outside. You just have to know that if you go around and you find businessman X or ex-military man Y, it's very hard. They're going to have to spend a lot of time studying what education is so that they can shout down all those arguments. And you won't believe the backlash when you actually get somebody like that. There is a school in the suburb of Seattle where a reform superintendent came in. The poor guy, I think, died of a heart attack soon after he left. But his tenure in office was awful. He tried to do all the things that I told you about. Went to the classrooms, did all that. And the teachers' unions hated him. And there are videos on YouTube, actually, when they were in the middle of a teacher's strike. And you should see some of the things they say and how mean-spirited they are.
Kind of like what we're experiencing
this is a battle.
today in our government.
I think I'm being called away because I know y'all have a bunch of questions, but I'm not at leisure to setting the time. What should I do?
Dr. Ward?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just going to grab the floor. First off, I'm not a paid sponsor here, but a lot of your questions and things that people have mentioned, go to Hillsdale's website. I had the pleasure of going to their seminar last summer. If you watch those videos, you'll get to hear a number of the staff from the college speak and some guest speakers, and it's just wonderful. You get to where you just want to soak it all in and you want more and more. If you go to Mr. Kilgore's portion of their website, his recommended reading list, ED Hirsch, and a number of others, it's going to help you to start to grasp the lingo and the mindset of where our education system is now, and it's not good. I mean, the books are great, but it just, for a while it depresses you. But at the same time, I'm a mom of 5, and I live in Worthington. And you feel like you're all alone. You start reading this and you realize, oh my gosh, I'm not delusional. This is really, I don't have this crazy idea of out there. This is really what's out there. And it's just great to build your confidence and to help you see some of what needs to be done. And your essay on there too, on the website about classical education, it's really good too. So if you just go to their website, there's so much great information out there. And if you can in any way find a way to stand up to tell your community how much they would benefit from classical charter school rather than be threatened by it, you will do your community and your kids great service. Because that's where I am. The school board is never going to let you, and their parents are so sucked in by what they have been told and by what their kids come home with that they don't even realize what their kids are missing. So, sorry to take your time, but
No, I think this is all where we start, and this is where we start to network and start having a dialogue on how to inform your communities that there are better ways to